the Black Doctors Podcast, Season 6.
Hello, welcome back to the Black Doctors Podcast. I am Steven, your host, your friendly neighborhood anesthesiologist and clinical medical ethicist. Thanks for joining us for another episode of the show. Thanks for rocking with us. Definitely been trying to keep the content consistent and continue with these weekly episodes out on Mondays. I've been a little busy with fellowship. As a lot of you may know, I recently finished my time in the Navy and went back to the civilian world, started fellowship in critical care medicine back in Chicago. So as you can imagine, it's been pretty busy, but so far I've been able to keep up with the podcast. And so thank you so much for your support. Please continue to bear with me. I think I posted an episode late here or there. This week, I'm actually going to do something I don't do often. It's an episode where I'm just going to talk and share some stories, share some sea stories. I've had some requests for information about my experiences as a physician in the Navy, and I'm going to talk about that today. First, we're going to hear a word from our sponsor, Picmonic.
This podcast is sponsored by Picmonic. In 2011, two medical students came up with the ingenious idea to combine medical education with unforgettable characters and ridiculously memorable stories. Featuring over 35,000 high-yield facts and graphics, Picmonic has helped over 600,000 students improve exam scores and perform better clinically. Picmonic has resources for pre-med and medical students, as well as other healthcare professions. Check out the show notes for a link to their website. Mention the podcast when you subscribe. With Picmonic, you can study less, but remember more.
Awesome. Thank you, Picmonic, for supporting the Black Doctors Podcast, for supporting increasing diversity in our healthcare workforce. So, as you probably know, I recently completed my time in the Navy. I think I do have an episode previously where I talked about my experiences in the Navy, kind of from a broader perspective, and the reasons why I joined, a lot of it dealing with my family. And I briefly touched on some of my experiences. When I recorded that episode, I was still on active duty. There's a lot of things that, I figured were better left unsaid until I had officially separated from the Navy. But now I am kind of a civilian or veteran. I honestly don't fully have my DD-214, which is like that paperwork that you need to definitively be like, oh yeah, I am no longer on active duty. It's like 3 or 4 months late because of paperwork issues, and everything kind of in the government just runs a little slow. So as far as I know, though, I am out of the Navy. So I am going to talk about medicine on the high seas. I'm going to talk about one of the experiences that I had in the Navy. I deployed for 5 months aboard one of the Navy's hospital ships. We did a humanitarian aid mission. And I'm going to talk about that today and just share some of those experiences. For background, the military, the Department of Defense, the U.S. Navy currently maintains 2 hospital ships. There's the Mercy, which is ported in San Diego. It's out on the West Coast. And on the East Coast is the Comfort and Mercy. So both of these ships are refurbished, I guess, reformatted, however you call it, oil tankers. So they're ginormous vessels. And there's actually kind of a history of the U.S. Navy and the hospital ships and how we treated our injured shipmates, our injured service members while abroad. And there's been, different iterations of these hospital ships over the years. The concept being, a lot in World War II, Vietnam, you would port a little bit off where the fighting is, and they'd be able to take wounded folks to the ship where there's military physicians, and we can patch them up and help them heal. So the most recent iteration, I think back in like the 90s, is when they refurbished these oil tankers, and they created these 2 ginormous hospital ships, the Comfort and the Mercy. They're painted all white. They have a big red cross on the side. You've probably seen pictures of them because one of the ships went to New York recently with the pandemic. So I was on the East Coast. I was at Naval Medical Center at Portsmouth. It was like my duty station. So I would go there to work at the hospital every day. But I was kind of my billet to deploy with was the USNS Comfort, the hospital ship. So there I was in Virginia. I had finished residency in 2018, moved to Virginia to start my time with the Navy. I had 4 years. So 2019, the spring was when I had news, just kind of an email like, hey, you're going to go out on the Comfort when it deploys for this humanitarian aid mission. They didn't really know the timing or the dates because with the military, stuff's always kind of changing. So they're like, oh, you're going to leave in April, so start packing your stuff. And I found out in like March, it's going to leave next month. Cool. Okay, whatever. So I started to plan to get out of there. I was trying to, work on my relationship. I was in a long distance relationship. My girlfriend at the time lived in New York. So I'm trying to figure out how that's going to work, trying to see her for a couple of times before I pull out for at least 5 months. That's what they're saying. They didn't really know how long we're going to be gone for. It's anywhere from like 3 to 6 months. We didn't know. So of course, in true military fashion, the dates keep getting pushed to the right. And we didn't even really leave until June. But as of May, I had fully kind of disconnected from the hospital I was at. So instead of going to work at the hospital every day, I would instead go to the hospital ship. It was kind of based out of the Navy base. I would drive there. I had to wear a uniform. Up until then, I really didn't wear a uniform in the Navy because I just would wear civilian clothes in, change into scrubs, work in the ORs, and then go home. So I had to pull out my uniform, get a second uniform, and remember how to salute because we didn't really salute when we were in civilian clothes, going to our hospital. So I would start showing up there. There was another anesthesiologist. He was senior. He was a captain, which is in the Navy is the equivalent of a full bird colonel in the Army or Air Force. So an 06, they wear a eagle collar device. So he was kind of showing me the ropes. We would show up. This was when it got pretty sweet because I would have to show up for muster. Muster is just a gathering time. So I'd show up there at 9 in the morning and there really wasn't anything to do. So then we would peace out around 11 o'clock. And I was like, this doesn't feel right. But I would jump behind the captain and just follow him. I would carry his bag and we would just bounce out the ship. We walk down the gangway, walk down the pier. We'd be out. Everybody's jumping out of the way, saluting him. And I'm just right behind him. And we're calling it a day. So I had 2 weeks worth of these super easy cush days. Took some long weekends, got to see my girlfriend at the time and was packing my bags and making sure I had everything that I needed to deploy. The other thing that came out of this was they're oh, since you're kind of based on the ship, you're going to be the department head of anesthesia for the mission. I was okay, that's cool. I was, just barely a year out of residency. So I'm what does that mean? I guess I should look at supplies. So I started looking at, what is the plan for the mission? At the time, they're you're going to be doing 10 mission stops, 10 different countries. We're going to try to do 100 operations per surgery or per mission stop. So about 1,000 surgeries. Okay. So my next question, what kind of surgeries are we going to do? And they didn't really have an answer. There was a advanced planning team that would go out, but that team was composed of a random hodgepodge of people. There was maybe 1 or 2 surgeons, 1 or 2 anesthesiologists, and then a bunch of nurses, nurse corps officers, so med surg or other people that don't, typically work in the operating rooms that don't actually provide medical services, if you will. So they didn't have a good answer for how many types of each surgery. So I'm okay, because it makes a difference. If it's an appendectomy or a cholecystectomy, what type of anesthesia are we going to provide? Are we going to do general anesthetics for stuff? If it's hernias, then sure, we can do general anesthetics with LMAs. We can do spinals. I'm trying to coordinate the supplies for this mission. And they're oh, we're going to do pediatric cases too. Okay, well, how many pediatric cases are we going to do? What are the age groups? Because I'm trying to plan how many endotracheal tubes do I need of what size? How many IVs do I need of what size? I'm going through this stock room that hadn't been sorted through since the ship last deployed a year or 2 years before. I'm trying to find all these supplies and trying to look through these lists. And they give me a spreadsheet that is ridiculously long with all the names of all these devices and stuff that we need. And how much anesthetic do we have? How much anesthetic gas? How much propofol? And the pharmacist wasn't even checked into the ship yet. We didn't have any drugs in the ship. And I'm just trying to figure out what am I supposed to do for this mission? What equipment do we have? What do we have for airway management tools? Are we going to be able to sterilize the blades, the laryngoscope blades? Are we going to be able to process the glide scope blades? Do we have any glide scopes? How many do we have? Do we have any fiber optic scopes? So I'm going through all of this stuff on this really old ship. And I find like an old school fiber optic, the type that comes in like a little suitcase and you got to take it apart and there's just the eyepiece. And it was like super dirty. I'm like, can we even clean these? So as I learned more about the capabilities of the ship, walking around, I think we had 10 or 12 operating rooms. And one of those was like a IR hybrid suite. And we had, 3 bays of quote unquote ICUs, a little bit of isolation rooms. There was, sterilization capabilities on the ship so they could clean the surgical instruments and whatnot. And so I'm like slowly learning. And then after working, I actually worked a lot for like a couple of days, like really stressing over this list of like, do we have the right tools to do this job, to do this mission safely? And then I meet with like one of the head OR nurses on the ship, and they're like, oh yeah, somebody already ordered all your stuff for you, the supply officer. I'm like, well, that's great. I wish somebody would have told me 3 days ago so I wouldn't have stressed out over this so much. And then number 2, does the supply officer really know about anesthesia and what we need to safely do our job? So this is, leading up into the mission. Fortunately, I was able to like kind of moonlight, and since I was off, so I could take the extra time to work at, some side hustles and make some extra money. Anyways, so the day comes, I'd moved a bunch of my stuff on board. I moved a bunch of my musical instruments because I'm like, there's probably going to be a fair amount of downtime, and, I'll be able to like pass the time somehow. So then my family comes down actually to Virginia to say goodbye. I spent that last weekend up in New York seeing my girlfriend, and then they dropped me off at the ship, and that's it. I go aboard, and I was living in a stateroom for the officers. We had staterooms that held anywhere from like 6 to 8 dudes, and same for the woman officers. And then for the enlisted berthing, like you're just in this big open bay room with bunk beds that are like 3 high. There's like 60 people to this room, right? So it's how the military does kind of like enlisted and officer. So enlisted, you typically finish like high school and then go in straight after high school. If you're an officer, you probably went to college or something. And there's like a clear distinction between enlisted and officer. It's kind of weird, kind of hard to wrap my head around because I kind of just see people as people, but the military makes a big divide. Like at my hospital, we even had different changing rooms. Like our locker rooms there was male officers, female officers, male enlisted, female enlisted. And there's like, rules about fraternization and what you can and can't do. Anyways, so I'm living in this stateroom. I'm living in these like 2 little cubbies with all my stuff. I had, one of the guys with the Navy band. He was one of my roommates. I had a Brazilian naval officer for a roommate. I had a State Department guy. He was pretty cool. Cool to pick his brain. I think a nurse or 2. And then I think one of the CRNAs was in my room as well. The anesthesia department was like myself and 4 or 5 anesthesiologists, and then 3 or 4 CRNAs. And, the plan was to run 3 or 4 operating rooms at each mission site. And again, do about 100 cases per visit. So we sail out of Virginia. The first stop was actually going to be Miami, and we had to like take on some supplies or whatever. So we get down to Miami, like we sail away. It's kind of a weird feeling to leave land. It's like a cruise, but not as much fun. And we're on the ship, and I remember being on the helipad and walking around, and they have this thing where like you man the rails. So you put on your dress white uniform, and then everybody like lines up around the edge of the ship, and it looks really cool. And there's like really good pictures. But I'd have like advice is like for all the stuff that you're packing, you don't need to pack like all these different uniforms. Just pack your camouflage uniform. It's like your working uniform. And then we wore this like navy blue romper, for lack of a better term, or like a onesie around the ship. So I didn't pack like my dress whites, or I honestly never even purchased the dress blue uniform. So I kind of hung out. I didn't man the rails, but we were all out, walking around the deck. And then we pull out. We sell for like a day, maybe 2 days, and you lose your cell phone service. Every now and then you get close enough to shore where you can pull out your cell phone and like get a little bit of reception. The internet on the ship is horrible. Like it takes so long just to even like pull up email from Gmail. And finally we could see Miami. We're like doing circles off the coast of Miami because they got to wait for the pier or the dock to clear up so they can bring the ship in. So that was cool. We show up in Miami. We just kind of had a little taste of what it's like to be underway. And they gave us liberty. They're like, all right, if you're not on duty, you can go out into Miami. You can explore. They give us like set hours. Like you had to be back by like 1 a.m. or something. There's like a curfew. And so I was able to get off the ship. We had to have, what do you call them? Liberty buddies, I think. Yeah. You had to have like a buddy that you sign out with that I'm going to stick with this person the whole time. It's like this accountability thing that the military does. So even though we were in Miami, Florida, it was wild. But I think, part of that is to decrease the risk of like assault and other bad stuff happening because you have a buddy. So my buddy Josh from college actually lived in Miami. So he came down. We were actually able to hung out with some friends down there and then back on the ship. Then there's this whole thing like Mike Pence, who was vice president at the time. So he came to the ship to take a tour. So they hit me up and they're like, yo, Steven, yeah, we want you to like do this photo op thing. They didn't say it was a photo op. They just asked, like, okay, can you be in your dress blues to like accompany the vice president on the ship? And I was like, yeah. So, my uniform's actually like in the wash. I didn't bring it, remember? And then they're like, all right, well, what about the whites? Because like in a matter of like 4 hours, they changed the plan from everybody wearing their dress blues to everybody wearing their dress whites. And then I was like, yeah, don't have those either. And then they're like, all right, well, what do you have? I'm like, I just got my camouflage uniform. And number two, like I really wasn't trying to accompany Mike Pence on a tour of anything. So I got off the hook of that one. I mean, I just like, nah, like I'm good. Y'all can find some other people. So I found some other people. The vice president comes on the ship. Got to see all like the security and people like setting that stuff up. So he goes on a tour of the ship. That's cool. It's in the news. And then we weigh anchor and we shove off. Yeah. So I'm trying to remember what the first stop on the mission was. Looking back, so I kind of documented a little bit of it in my phone. I remember we had to sail through the Panama Canal. So that was cool. They called it, I think, crossing the ditch or something. There's a couple of things in the military and the Navy that are like classic moments or whatever. So we had to cross the ditch. It was cool. We pulled up to the Panama Canal and we sailed through that because the first mission stop, I think, was either in Ecuador or Peru. So the rough part was like Miami to Panama because, we're just out to sea for a ridiculously long amount of time and no self-service, no reception, no internet. And every day was just like, we would get up for muster at 7 a.m, have to meet. And then they talk about the plan of the day, which is really nothing because there's nothing to do. Although they did like set up different panels or what do you call them? Like committees, because we were technically like a hospital at sea. So everybody was kind of like jumping on the opportunity to be head of the cardiac arrest committee or be head of the medical executive committee and all these different things, because in the Navy, you want all this stuff to pad your fitness reports, like your evaluations. And it happens every year you get an evaluation, and that goes towards if you're able to promote or not. So little did I know, right? I didn't really care too much because I was pretty much for sure going to promote to 04. And I knew in my time of service, I wasn't going to promote to 05. So I didn't really need to push or fight to promote. But it was just this mad scramble of everybody trying to get these different like committees and organizations. So in between, we would just watch movies because people would download like a ton of bootleg movies. We watch movies and we would honestly just sleep. We called it rack ops. Like your bed is called a rack. So you just go to bed. Like you would get up, maybe grab breakfast. Usually I just like stumble out of bed, throw on my onesie, go up and muster at like 0700, 08, whatever time it was. You'd stand in attention, you say the Sailor's Creed, and then they'd be like, all right, this is the plan of the day, which really wasn't anything. And then I would go back to bed. So we called it rack ops or rack to the future. You would literally just sleep to pass the time. Get up, eat lunch, go back to bed. There's other stuff to do. Like there was some spin bikes that they brought on the ship. There's a little gym, but it was all kind of crowded and gross. So We sailed through the Panama Canal. We made it to our first mission stop.
Hey there, I hope you're enjoying listening to the show. I wanted to take a minute to talk about TrueLearn and thank them for sponsoring the Black Doctors Podcast. TrueLearn is a medical exam preparation company that helps you outperform on your boards. If you are a medical student or resident physician, you should definitely check out their products. If you sign up, please use the code BDPodcast and you'll get a discount. They have resources for both DO students as well as MD students and even physician assistants. When it comes to residency licensure, they offer question banks for over 8 different specialties. TrueLearn gives analytics that give you insight into your study habits, your question responses, and tracks you along with your peers. Students and residents average 20% improvements after completing a TrueLearn Smart Bank. Check them out at truelearn.com. And again, remember to use the code BDPodcast to receive your special discount. Now back to the show.
So some of the countries we visited, we went through the Panama Canal. I think our first mission stop was in Ecuador, so Manta, Ecuador. We were there for a week. Each mission stop was about a week. We went from Ecuador to Peru. We went from Peru to Costa Rica, from Costa Rica to Panama, Panama City. We sailed back through the canal, and then we hung out in Panama City for a Liberty port. So we were moored for like 2 or 3 days. We could get off the ship and spend like 2 days on land and like experience Panama City and, just like sleep in a hotel, get some good food. Still had to have a Liberty buddy, technically on paper, to like go everywhere with and make sure nothing bad happened. We went from Panama City to Liberty Port to Colón, Panama for a mission stop. Spent a week there. We spent a week in Colombia. Santa Marta, Colombia, doing surgery. We then had a Liberty port in Curacao. By now, it was like September, right? Remember, we left in June. It's September now. We stopped in Curacao. I was lucky to have my girlfriend fly out. And even still, it was like this thing where like we were there for 3 days, but technically you were only supposed to have 2 days off because you would have had to hold duty on the ship, which means like you just have to stay on the ship just because we didn't really, we didn't sell the ship. We didn't do anything to like make the ship run. There's a whole civilian mariner crew, but like military tradition means that somebody has to like be on the ship at all times. So I was able to work out something where I was able to spend all 3 days with my girlfriend. So that was cool. Curacao was amazing. We went from Curacao to Trinidad and Tobago. And from Trinidad and Tobago, we went to Grenada. Got to stop at the St. George's University School of Medicine down there and meet with some of their students. From Grenada, we went to St. Lucia. That was cool. That's when, Dr. Jerome Adams, the Surgeon General of the United States, he had kind of flown down. So we got to meet him, work with him. He came to the operating rooms and we did some anesthesia together. And from there, we went to St. Kitts and Nevis, however you say that, and the Dominican Republic. That was mission stop number 10. Kingston, Jamaica, we stopped at. Then Haiti was the last mission stop. And we ended up sailing back to the U.S. in late November. So for each of those mission stops, right, we would show up. The first day, we would weigh anchor off port or whatever, and we went out with a helicopter squadron. It was really just 2 helicopters, SH-60 Seahawks. So I think they're called the Dragon Whales. And this helicopter was a kind of a support detachment. So we would fly a lot of our supplies out because each place we went to, we would have 2 medical engagement sites, which provided like primary care services. So they would fly off all this equipment from the ship for like the day before. There'd be forklifts and whatnot, putting all of the pallets onto the flight deck. Helicopter would fly off. They would pick up the stuff, drop it off, come back, pick it up, drop it off. And then the crew would go out to help set up the engagement site. That was day 1. Day 2, the operating room services would go out. So the surgeons, the CRNAs, anesthesiologists, OR nurses we would go out to one of the medical engagement sites and we would work all day screening patients. We would try to screen 100 patients in one day. So we were super duper busy. They made a big deal like, oh, don't go outside the wire. Don't leave the medical engagement sites. Mind you, like we're in like Ecuador and Costa Rica. And then people are acting like for security purposes, you can't leave. I'm like, okay, well, whatever. So I would always try to order like Uber Eats or whatever that country's equivalent was, just to get some food that was different from the food we got on the ship. So we would see a lot of patients and we would screen them and we was all paper charting and we'd look at, the medical history and make sure they're appropriate to come on the ship because our resources were still fairly limited. And the briefing that I got from my anesthesia department before we left was like, hey, you got to be careful when you're doing these humanitarian aid missions because, any bad outcome is like a really big deal. It's like an international incident. We're providing free services and we're trying to help people, but you got to be very careful because your altruism can really get out of hand. And then something bad happens and, it's bad politically, it's bad for the patient, it's bad for the mission. So I was very careful about setting out strict kind of guidelines for preoperative evaluation. I took what they used at the last mission, actually liberalized a couple of things. So we let on like folks that were BMI up to 35. I think the previous mission, they cut the BMI at 30. What else? I liberated some of the blood pressure goals. So we would take patients with systolics under 190 and diastolics under 100 was kind of one of our main limits. And so it was kind of a learning on the fly, like how to manage anesthesia department, how to parlay with the surgeons, how to get along, because there was the other folks that are running the mission that are like the higher ups. And, a lot of stuff that we would do would get reported up. So if we had to cancel a case, there'd be people wanting to know why. If we couldn't support certain cases, then, what's going on. So in terms of surgical capabilities, we deployed with one orthopedic surgeon. We deployed with a pediatric surgeon. We deployed with, I think, 3 or 4 general surgeons. We had an oral maxillofacial surgeon as well, and a plastic surgeon. There was also a urologist that joined us halfway through the mission. And then we had 2 ophthalmologists. We also had some other help from foreign militaries. So we had an ophthalmologist from Mexico, from the Mexican Army. We had 2 Canadian oral surgeons. We had a Brazilian orthopedic surgeon and I think a Brazilian general surgeon. So that was kind of the team, and that's how we kind of screened the cases, whatever was appropriate and within their purview. So we would go ashore, we would look at over 100 plus patients, and then we kind of book each subsequent operative day. And, we plan for, about 12 to 15 surgeries a day and, get up to like 100, 120 cases for the week that we were there. It was always tough because eventually we'd start to run out of spots and we'd be like, oh man, we got to like turn people away. And a lot of times there was just tons and tons of people at these facilities, at these medical engagement sites. They'd be lined up to come see us and hopefully get surgeries. And mostly what we would do is like hernia repairs and cholecystectomies and lipomas. And then the plastic surgeons and oral surgeons would do cleft lips, cleft palate stuff. And then the orthopedic surgeon wasn't super busy, but that's mostly what the surgical cases were. So after a super long day of screening patients, we would go back on the ship. They would bring that first group of patients to the ship and, get them in the wards. And then we would prepare for the cases the next day. We'd show up, we'd have a plan and just start doing anesthesia. I even liberalized kind of the staffing model. So we would have an anesthesiologist kind of running the board and covering the recovery unit and other medical emergencies aboard the ship. And then everybody would do their own cases. The military, there's the anesthesiologists do their own cases. The CRNAs practice unsupervised. So everybody would just do their own cases. And we always had an anesthesiologist available to help with case starts or help out in case of emergency. And then we had different corpsmen that were our anesthesia techs and kind of medical techs. So we would start up at 7. We'd, start doing cases and they'd operate and, we might break for lunch or we just eat lunch whenever we could in the middle of the day and then finish up around like 5 o'clock on 4 or 5 o'clock on most days. The patients would spend the night on the ship. That same day, they would bring on patients that we'd signed up for surgery. The next day, that new group of patients would have surgery. The last group of patients would go home, and then that new group would join. So it was kind of this revolving door of patients, and they'd have to take them across in like a water taxi. Sometimes they flew them on by helicopter. So that's kind of how we worked each site. And we would just operate for 6 days straight. Ideally get up to like, I don't know, 100 plus patients per mission stop. So super tiring. By the end of the week, we'd just be exhausted. And then once we were done, the last of the patients would go back ashore. The helicopters would go out, pick up all of the equipment and pallets from the medical engagement sites. Then we would pull the anchor up and then head on to the next destination. So we did that again and again and again. Then we stopped at some Liberty ports. That was cool, except for all the rules. They would literally like give us a briefing. So in Panama City, there's some drama. Like the biggest like thing about this humanitarian aid mission was that this is like in large part kind of propaganda or our show of goodwill towards South America and the Caribbean. So it was very, as we started to realize halfway through the mission, like we weren't just there to help people. It was very political, right? It's the United States government fostering goodwill to our neighbors in the Caribbean, Central America, and South America, right? Because of the whole border issue. Even going back in history, the banana wars and people that our government's actually assassinated down there. When we invaded Panama, like there's always like stuff in our history. And I guess part of this healing process is us going down there and providing free medical care. So in that context was like kind of how they would give us these briefings for when we go to these different countries. So we had a Liberty port in Panama, and they're kind of like had a State Department person come and talk to us about like, oh, there's like this history. And like you can go back and read about the invasion of Panama and like what kind of sparked it. But there's, some shady stuff that, our government was mixed up in, and we definitely invaded a sovereign country. So they're like, yeah, some of the folks in Panama might not be too happy about that. So, move accordingly, be careful, like don't be loud, obnoxious American military person. Kind of common sense if you've ever traveled abroad, but, a lot of these folks are really young and they just, kind of don't want to get into trouble. So they would have like green zones and red zones, and they show us a map and like you can be in this area and you have to have your Liberty buddy and you can't go here and you have to be in on curfew. And so that sucked a little bit of the fun out of the port, but it was just nice to like be in a hotel and, have a nice clean shower, eat good food. So that was a Liberty port. And then about halfway through the mission, because before like we would show up to these different countries and they would say, don't go outside the wire. You can't, like we could not leave the ship. There was like this kind of contentious because as the physicians and other folks, we were just there to work, but then there was like the senior enlisted, like the chiefs and other people that had like kind of inside jobs, like they were managing the medical engagement sites, or they had some other position and they had some kind of like cover where they could just go ashore and hit the bar and like, do whatever. Meanwhile, we're just all stuck on the ship. So we spent a lot of time watching movies, watching series, and just sleeping. And I remember, for the relationship, like it was tough because to be out where you could, you didn't have cell phone service in most parts inside the ship. So you had to go outside the ship to get cell phone service. But to go outside, you had to have your onesie on. If that was like after working hours, because during working hours, you're supposed to wear your type 3 uniform, which is like the camouflage. So boots and pants and blouse and all this stuff. You had to get dressed up just to go outside and try and talk on the phone. So that was like super duper annoying. And then, trying to catch my girlfriend at the right time. And she's got a whole life that's going on and she was changing jobs and all this other stuff. So it was super tough on our relationship, but we made it through. Like there was even rules like, oh, you can't sit down on deck. Like you couldn't bring a lawn chair out and just sit down because it didn't look good. It was all this other stuff going on. Then there was like military police folks that would like walk around the ship and kick you out if you weren't in dress code. Anyways, it's neither here nor there. So we went to Panama, we had a Libertyport, we had a couple more mission stops, and then we went to our other Libertyport in Curacao. Some of the stops, like we would usually anchor off the coast, and then we have to take like little Liberty boats. So we go down to the bottom of the ship. We would board a small boat and then just travel ashore to the pier, and then we'd jump on a shuttle bus, and then we'd take the bus to the medical engagement site. I think in Costa Rica, it was so far away that they helicoptered us in and out. So we would board the helicopter, and then they'd fly us to the medical engagement site, and then they would fly us back. That was like, it was kind of cool, except, you know, the whole helicopter thing just didn't look super safe because you would see like the helicopter squadron, and, you know, all these people are like really young. There's not a whole lot of old people around because they're all like high ranking usually if you're older. But there's a bunch of young people, and you would see them pull these helicopters out on the flight deck. You would see them at like 5, 6 o'clock in the evening, like take the helicopter apart, like entirely. The entire motor that spins the rotor would just be wide open. They're out there blasting music and just working on the freaking helicopter and putting it back together, taking it apart. And I'm like, yeah, y'all want me to get on that and fly. And then one of the helicopters, there was two, one of them was like always broke. They had to like fly some actual like mechanics from, you know, whoever, Northrop Grumman or whoever, like Sikorsky, I don't know. They had to fly the mechanics out to actually fix the helicopter. And then you'd see them like, okay, we fixed it. And then the pilots would take it up and like test fly it around the ship. I'm like, oh my God. So as cool as it sounds, like take a helicopter into work, like I was really not trying to take those helicopters. So then otherwise we'd just take a ship, and that was our commute. But we spent a lot of time, you know, we would play cards, we would have movie night, and just sleep. Like I've never slept so much just to pass the time. So that was the mission. Halfway through, you know, I'm like the supply person, I'm a department head. I'm trying to keep track of all the stuff. Remember the beginning when I was like super worked up about, hey, we need supplies, how many cases are we going to do, how many pediatric cases. So I've been doing a pretty good job. And then like, you know, things were going too smoothly, and we ran out of circuits for the anesthesia machines. We're like, okay, well, that's kind of a problem, but you know, you can actually like reuse the circuits as long as you have a filter on it. So I'm like figuring this stuff out. I'm like, all right, we can do this workaround. It's, you know, safe, it's FDA approved and all that. You can, and I'm like trying to read up on this stuff on the internet that works super slow. I'm trying to read up on it with my phone, you know, when I have service, about how can we navigate this since we're running out of circuits. So cool. We can put filters on them, and we can reuse the circuits a couple times, and we can use them for the day, whatever. Well, then we start running out of circuits, and we're like, oh my God. So, and we only got mail like 3 or 4 times this whole period. And then we'd have to schedule like, what do you call them? Unreps at sea, where there'd be another ship that comes next to us. And then we would hook up with ropes, and then they would give us fuel. They would give us supplies. So I had to try to like schedule all of this stuff in advance and forecast what we would need. So we ran out of circuits, we ran out of filters, and everybody from the high up was like, oh no, how are we going to do this mission? How are we going to continue on? And I'm sitting there brainstorming. We're in the Caribbean at this point. I'm like, well, I know Guantanamo Bay in Cuba is like a little ways away. I'm like, hey, there's an option we can fly up there, because I'm sure that hospital, I'd actually deployed to Gitmo for a month before this. I'm like, I know they have supplies. We can get them from them. So I presented that option. And then I remembered like there's this kind of contingency plan of supplies in case we had to actually go to war. And I was like, hey, well, actually, there's this contingency plan that's in the storage hold, so we can go get that stuff if we need it. So that's what we ended up doing just to get through that mission stop. Finally was like the drama, right? Because as you work with other healthcare professionals, you work with surgeons. I'm the department head of anesthesia, but I'm also like very junior ranking. I was a lieutenant at the time, so 03. I actually promoted to 04 just towards the end of the mission. But I, eventually, like one of the medical engagement sites, the anesthesia folks ended up not going ashore. And so the surgeons just went buck wild and just let everybody on. I was like, yo, we went through all of this criteria for folks to be eligible for surgery on the ship. So they brought this guy on that had a hernia, but he was morbidly obese and his blood pressure was like 220 over 110. I'm like, oh my God. Like we talked about not having bad outcomes and being very risk averse. And so I had to kind of dig my heels in. I went to the director of surgical service and like, hey, this guy, like, he's not an ideal candidate for us to do surgery under these conditions. And the surgeon was like, all right, well, he's here now, and it would look really bad for us to send him back ashore without having a surgery. And I'm like, well, and it was like one of those things where you aren't really planning on getting into any conflict and like, how do you manage the situation? You don't really learn this in medical school. You don't learn it in life. It's just, I guess as stuff happens. So at this point, the only thing I could say was like, well, because there's other anesthesiologists that were more senior than me. There's even some CRNAs that had more rank than I did. I said, hey, as a clinician, as an anesthesiologist, as a physician, he is not an appropriate candidate for me to provide anesthesia for. And I left it at that. And then somebody else ended up doing the case. And as far as we know, things went okay. But that was one of the first times I've had to really dig my heels in clinically. Looking back at the nature of the mission, it brings up so many concepts with regards to humanitarian aid, to ethics, that I think it's called I don't want to misspeak, the white knight or the white savior model of humanitarian aid, where you show up and you do always good for the community and then you leave. And what's been pushed more recently, what's been encouraged, is those groups where you go in and partner with the local communities and you give them transferable skills. And so when you leave, they are able to continue on with improved standards of care. So that was one issue, number one. Number two was the whole political nature of the mission. I talked with one of the senior enlisted folks from the command, because for this mission, there's actually 3 different command structures. So there is the hospital. There's a hospital with our commanding officer. There was the civilian mariners. Those are the folks that are like merchant marines that actually sail the ship, and they just live at sea pretty much and live on the ship. And then third was the Desron, this was a big Navy representative essentially, because as physicians and nurses, we don't really work with big Navy in terms of what the mission plan is and communicating with other service ships. But there's a commodore of the task force essentially, and he was the head honcho as far as big Navy was concerned. So he was on his own agenda. So while we were out doing surgeries and providing services for the local population, he was out golfing with heads of state and breaking bread with all these political figures, because that was the real nature of the mission. Was they want to go and parlay. And I don't know what all the topics were. Some of the stuff that got filtered out was what we call it, drug interdiction in Costa Rica, or in Central America rather. Some of it was religious extremism in one of the countries in South America, and there's always other underlying issues. And we were just kind of the front for giving us a reason to be there. So that was the two of the interesting things. And then number 3 was just the leadership, the morale. We were really coddled and didn't have a lot of freedom, and everything was very restrictive, which eventually began to kind of take a toll on people's mental health. So there was sailors that would have to get sent home early because of mental health issues and just depression, and it was kind of rough to experience and see that. But overall, it was a very interesting experience, one that I think I'm glad that I had. 5 months at sea was a super long time, but again, I grew so much with regards to leadership and operating room management of anesthesia group. And it, I guess, strengthened my relationship with my girlfriend, or at least, it didn't destroy our relationship. thankfully, though it got pretty close at times. So yeah, for all those folks out there that have asked me about my experiences in the hospital ship, because so many people join the Navy, they're like, oh, I want to be on the Mercy or the Comfort. And it's like, you really don't know what that means until you're out there. But it will be a memorable experience one way or the other. Happy to discuss further if you have any specific questions. I think I have a link on my website for questions about military medicine, and my my inbox is always full on Instagram. I have a ton of pictures from the deployment. Like if you scroll back, you got to scroll back to like 2019 on my Instagram page. It's at Stephen Bradley MD. If you go back to 2019, you'll see a bunch of pictures and images from when I was deployed in this humanitarian aid mission. So if you're curious, you can go back and check that out. So let me know. Appreciate any and all feedback on the show. If you leave a comment or a message or a rating, wherever you listen to the show, whether it's on Spotify, iTunes, or Apple Podcasts, would always appreciate your feedback. Thank you so much for listening. I'm going to try my best to keep the content coming. A little busy with fellowship, but so far we're making it work. I hope you enjoyed kind of this sea story. There's a couple more of these coming based upon your response. But thank you so much for listening. Tune in next week for another episode of the Black Doctors Podcast. We do this because representation matters.